So we've been looking in these videos at the Catholic theological landscape following Tracy Rowland's Catholic Theology. Again, the slides in this presentation are either quotes or paraphrases from her book, Credit Where Credit's Due. We looked at Thomism, which led us into the 20th century, the different species of Thomism. We're starting to look at these two different approaches in the 20th century, growing out of these two theological journals, Communio, and now we'll look at Concilium. And again, the importance of this hopefully is striking you, that depending on the starting points and emphases and priorities of these two different schools, the work of the Second Vatican Council is read differently. Our approach to theology takes on different methodologies and priorities. And this trickled down to the pews, and it still does. The divide is perhaps not as important as it was, say, in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But in that time period, the experience of a person in your average parish in the United States and the theology they were getting was largely based on what journal their professors or their priest professors were reading. So it really was a kind of a theological battle for how to understand where the church is today. So the older of these two approaches is actually Concilium. Concilium was founded right after the Second Vatican Council, and it was only about 7 years later, I think, that Communio broke away from Concilium. So let's look at some of the important aspects of the Concilium approach. Since its foundation in 1965, the Concilium Journal has been the flagship for Catholic theologians interested in correlating the faith to contemporary political movements or recontextualizing the faith with reference to the critical consciousness of a given era. And so that word correlating is important, and this has been done in different ways. But the idea is their starting point is the modern world, the concerns of the modern person, modern, sometimes political agendas. How do we recontextualize the faith in light of those things? So you can see there's a total 180 of priorities from the Communio school. The Communio school was, let's look at the faith, the traditions of the church, and interpret the world in the light of those. So how one begins is going to have ramifications for the entire theological project. So one of the great names here, again, is Karl Rahner. Not only does he represent Transcendental Thomism, but he's a main figure in the Concilium school. And his project for post-conciliar theology, that is, upon the completion of the Second Vatican Council, Karl Rahner saw the work of theology to touch on renewing every aspect. And in Tracy Rowland's book, she goes through several pages, actually, on what Karl Rahner wanted to reevaluate, and essentially it was everything. So for Rahner, the Second Vatican Council became a springboard for a kind of systematic house cleaning and renovation in the different fields of theology. So that for Rahner, the Council's call for dialogue, and particularly dialogue with the world, did not just entail a new additional and partial region of study for theology. It wasn't we just add on to our other studies this dialogue with the world. Rather, it entails engagement with every dimension of theology. Every dimension of theology, every piece now had to engage and correlate to the spirit of the modern world. One of the aspects here for Concilium scholars was correlating to or adapting to modern canons of rationality. Again, where is intellectual thinking today? That's where we need to be. So there's this question of openness or closure to modern conceptions of rationality. Rowland says this may be the most important marker distinguishing liberal and non-liberal theology. To what degree do we adapt to these modern and contemporary ways of thought, and to what degree do we critique them in light of the tradition? So for the Concilium scholar, if theology wants to be an academic science on par with other academic sciences, it must start from the basis of modern rationality. Part of that modern rationality is a questioning of historical events and how normative they can be. So historical contingent events things that happened one time in the past. For this modern rationality, those are inadequate vessels for timeless and universal truths of reason. You can't root a universal truth in one event in history. That means critical philosophy calls into question the validity of our historical revelation. It's mortally wounded by its cultural conditioning, right? How can we say that the experience of the people of Israel is normative for us? Well, it's terribly historically conditioned for these theologians. It's conditioned, it's contingent, and can't contain any ultimate truths that are necessary and abiding for us. Taken to its extreme, this would apply to the Christ event, that Jesus as a historical contingent person in a very specific setting can't remain absolutely normative. So there's a so-called hermeneutic of suspicion. We interpret things always with the questioning of authority and this normative tradition. There's really starting to be in this school a deconstructing of the once normative tradition. There's a deep distrust of the historical particularity of revelation. How can something that happened one time, a long time ago, be normative for us? As well as the particularities of ecclesial mediation of that revelation. How can the church claim to be normative? It's just one institution among others. And so this follows, this next slide follows upon that. There's also a difference for the Concilium scholars in the stance taken towards magisterial teaching, that is the teaching of the church, and the CDF, or the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, that body in the church that's, or that organ of the church that's responsible for magisterial teaching, guarding it and passing it on. Well, why? Since theology is a science, an academic science carried out in the academy, it would be, they say, an anomaly for theologians to require the nihil obstat, that is the permission to publish, from the magisterium if they want to do theology in the church's academies. That if we don't have the church overseeing biology, the church doesn't oversee mathematics, why is the church overseeing academic theology is the question. We'll look at another name here. We looked at Rahner. We'll also look at Edward Schillebeeckx. Schillebeeckx is a Dominican, begins his career, his academic career as a Thomist, and eventually takes on an enthusiasm for the Enlightenment project. And that means the Enlightenment authority is questioned. Authority, together with all traditions, institutions, norms, can no longer be justified by their mere existence, but they have to be justified by what? Reason, the principle of the Enlightenment. Well, that's going to apply to so many things within the Catholic circle. So you see right now, right here, this correlation with modern canons of rationality. For Schillebeeckx, whereas the church had until recently been judged only according to the gospel and theological criteria, well, now it's understood as one part of a whole complex establishment of society, right? It's just one more contingent, historically conditioned institution among others. And therefore it's subject to the same criticism as other such institutions, right? So the church kind of loses its sense of being an anchor. The criticism of the church for Schillebeeckx stems from a new understanding of Christ and the kingdom, such that it's impossible to believe in a Christianity that is not at one with the movement to emancipate mankind. So Schillebeeckx has a particular reading of Christ in the Gospels, Christology, as an eschatological prophet, and he says, listen, if the church isn't living up to what Christ intended, well, it needs to be judged according to those standards. Now, the whole question is, did Schillebeeckx read Christ right? And, well, there's other questions beyond that. But what you see happening, I suppose, is this relativization of the authority of the church, huh? So Schillebeeckx gives 3 tests for orthodoxy in his work, The Understanding of Faith, or 3 criteria for when we know something is proper teaching. He says, well, there's a proportional norm. He says, quote, a certain proportion in which subsequent expressions find themselves with regard to the intentionality of the faith as inwardly determined by the mystery of Christ. Now, if that seems a little difficult, it was for me too. So here's some of the explanation from the Rowland book. The idea is, what is normative for us, right, from the perspective of faith? are not Jesus's actual words or actions, right? Those are, again, historically contingent, conditioned. They happen in the past. That's not what's normative for us, his words or actions. But what's normative? The relation between the words and deeds of Jesus on the one hand, and their context, and our context, that should be, on the other. So that is to say, we're not called to imitate what Jesus did and said, but we're to relate to our context as Jesus did to his. That's the proportion. Are we acting in our situation as Jesus acted in his situation? Notice it relativizes everything according to history and contingent circumstances. We don't simply act as Christ acted because we're not in the same social milieu that he is. It completely relativizes Christ. What are we to do? We're supposed to relate in the same proportional way in our particular circumstances that Christ related in his. The second criteria for orthodoxy or true teaching for Schillebeeckx is orthopraxis, right? Orthodoxy, true teaching, is based on orthopraxis. Does it lead to correct action? He says it's not a consequence of a previously given communal unity of faith, but the manner in which such a communal unity and conviction is realized. I want to talk about that more. Remember, at the end of the slides for the Communio School, there's a priority of logos over praxis, of truth and doctrine and the tradition. That's what shapes praxis or action. For Schillebeeckx, it's the other way around. Orthopraxis. If we're acting properly, that's what judges our teaching. Well, the question is, well, what then is the measure of praxis, of action? And for the Concilium scholar, it's got to be, well, the spirit of the modern world, or whatever particular social or political agenda we're correlating the faith to. So you see the exact reversal of priorities here. And then finally, for Schillebeeckx, what tests orthodoxy or true teaching? The reception of the teaching by the whole people of God. Now, he doesn't mention what percentage or portion constitutes the whole people of God. Do 100% of everyone have to accept a teaching for it to be valid? Well, no. So what percentage? He does note that at times one part of the church or one region could actually become a locus theologicus, or a source of theology for the rest. So there's this tension. Just because a teaching is proposed by the church for Schillebeeckx, it has to be received by the church, and he doesn't actually tell us, well, who has to receive it, or sometimes he says even its non-reception or reception by a small portion could be normative for the rest of the church. This is an idea that didn't really stick around all that much. Notice what's lacking here from his tests for orthodoxy. There's no role really in for the magisterium of the church. The church is reduced to, well, here's what he says. He says the teaching office of the church can act as a means of communication within the Catholic community, as the regulator of the use of theological language, and as a decision-making authority in circumstances where someone expresses certain views concerning faith in a particular situation with its own special historical conditions. Again, if it's difficult to understand, we might say that this means the magisterium of the church, the teaching office, exists to moderate debates amongst theologians and the faithful. So the point being here, this reflects a tendency in the Concilium scholars to let go of the anchor of strong magisterial authority. Schillebeeckx on moral theology, right? So if history and the contingency and conditions of history are no longer seen as sources of normative truths, then it's no longer possible to find a secure ethical foundation in any objective construction of human nature or moral law, right? There is no set human nature, therefore no natural law. And then you turn to Revelation, and well, he says the New Testament has no specific ethical principle, no ethics of a categorical imperative, no commandments or prohibitions, no virtues or values that are not socially and historically conditioned. There's that priority again, that distrust of the historically contingent, right? This leaves him open to a greater degree to construct an ethics using philosophical ethics, the natural sciences, and above all, the social sciences, right? Anthropology, psychology. Notice again, the overarching theme here is the correlation of the faith to the modern and contemporary mind. Schillebeeckx talks about listening to foreign prophets, right? Schillebeeckx promoted a particular conception of dialogue in which the church has things to learn from the world. He says, quote, "The church cannot fulfill her prophetic task with regard to worldly problems of man and society simply by appealing to revelation, but only by listening very carefully to that foreign prophecy, that is the world, which appeals to her from the situation of the world and in which she recognizes the familiar voice of her Lord." Now, again, the contrast here is with the communio scholars. I think that's my next slide, perhaps. Yeah. Communio scholars, especially von Balthasar, Ratzinger, oppose this correlationist methodology, right? We don't look to the world as our starting point, or from where we take our agenda and then adapt revelation to it. No, our starting point is revelation. So for them, communio scholars, Catholic theology needs to clarify and affirm its own unique identity as such, and not in correlation with the ever-shifting contours of the contemporary situation. Now you can note the tension here, right? A theology that doesn't correlate at all to the world won't speak to the world. No one will receive it. No one will hear it. It will be useless. But a theology that completely correlates to the world will be changing with every whim of society. Every new opinion will need to be correlated with, and there'll be no firm ground to stand on. The question of how one starts methodologically ends up in very different approaches to theology as a whole. And then we can talk about, finally, for the Concilium scholars, the affirmation of secularism. Remember, the communio scholars were trying to diagnose secularism, this separation of the world from the realm of God. They were diagnosing it as a disease, in a sense. For the Concilium scholars, there's an affirmation of secularism. Secularization, this kind of autonomy of the world from God, is seen as the discovery of man's rational sphere, the work of the Enlightenment, rational sphere of understanding. A self-understanding which naturally takes place in history. It has to, right? With the result that secularization is a given with the growth of humanity and is therefore clearly a positive achievement. The Concilium strategy for liberating faith from its intellectual ghetto is what? To tie it up in the insights of its dialogue partner, the modern secular world. If we're going to address the modern world, that is, we have to do it on the world's terms. We'll end with this then. The communio scholars prefer to address secularism not by correlating the faith to modernity, but by stressing the Christocentric Trinitarianism, right? Going back to the fundamentals of the tradition, Christ and the Trinity, of Catholic theological anthropology, right? So we look at the human person, we don't look at the faith in the light of the human person. We look at the human person in light of Christ and the Trinity, to remind the person that the meaning of life is sanctification and preparation for eternal life with the Trinity. Two very different ways of approaching things. So hopefully as we went through this approach all the way from basically 1500 till what's still affecting the church now, you'll see this question: why do we see differences in Catholic theology? Why do we see different approaches, different emphases? It's rooted in these very different approaches that takes different starting points and different emphases and different priorities. And this will be a question for you as you go on in theology, as you're reading different sources. What are the presuppositions of the different scholars that you're reading? And eventually, what do you find as the most convincing grounding for theology and its tasks? So I think we can leave these topics with that.